started with our agenda for the day. The first thing is we have the privilege of having a group with us this morning, checking in on how we handle things in the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And so I think it's kind of interesting when they introduce themselves, particularly when they say who is their senator. That way you know if you have a constituent in the crowd. But we've got with us the Kansas Livestock Association Young Stockmen's Academy. And so I don't know if who. They better know. And so I don't know if Ms. Garagiola is in here and wants to start. I don't see her, or if you want to start. All right, well, it's good to have you with us and to see the various parts of the state that are here this morning. Mr. Vice Chairman, it sounds like you must have won the numbers game this morning as it relates to constituents who are with us.
I called him this morning and told him to show up.
Well, yeah, that's just around the corner, so it wasn't a problem for them to show up. All right, the first thing on our agenda, or the next thing on our agenda, is a bill hearing. So we will open up the hearing on Senate Bill 417, removing the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks Authority to exercise the right of eminent domain. And we shall begin with an overview from our staff. Revisor Lawrence, you are up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. You should have a copy of the bill and a copy of a memorandum from the revisor's office in front of you. I will tell you this is one of those rare instances when my summary of the bill is actually longer than the bill itself. Senate Bill 417 would repeal KSA 32840, which is the statute that gives the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks the authority to exercise the right of eminent domain in accordance with the Kansas Eminent Domain Procedure Act for the purpose of acquiring lands, water, and water rights to carry out the provisions of the wildlife and parks laws of the state, or protect, add to, and improve state parks, state lakes, recreation areas, wildlife areas, natural areas, fish hatcheries, and other lands, waters, and facilities under the purview of the Secretary. The bill would take effect upon publication in the Kansas Register, and I will tell you on the back of that memorandum that I pointed out is a copy of the statute that would be repealed, so you can see the full text of that as well, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, do you have questions of our staff? Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tamara, thank you. Where would it go to? Would it go to the legislature or the governor if for eminent domain, if we take it away from the Secretary of Parks and Wildlife?
Great question, Senator. Thank you. So, So in its sovereign power, the state actually has the power of eminent domain, and they are allowed to delegate that to different entities. And in this instance, with this statute, they have delegated a particular eminent domain power to the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks for those reasons that I listed and that are contained in the statute. So the state generally would still have that power of eminent domain, but this particular type of authority for eminent domain would no longer exist with the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it goes back to the governor or the legislature?
The legislature has the authority
Wait a
to
minute.
delegate that power.
Great question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wonderful question, Senator. Thank you. Yeah, the legislature has the power to delegate that authority.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. How often is this eminent domain used by the Secretary? Thank you.
Great question, Senator. I would defer. I would defer that question to the Secretary to be able to answer that question.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tamara, when was this right first given to the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks?
So this particular statute was enacted in 1927, but it does look like there was a prior law, and I don't know exactly what that prior law was, but that was in 1925 that conveyed a similar authority. So it's been a minute.
Do you know under what circumstances that was originally granted? Was it for a particular park or lake or?
I would have to do a little bit of research to find that out for you.
Thank you.
You said it's been a minute, as in 60 seconds. Do you
Close.
have knowledge how frequently the eminent domain authority has been exercised by the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks? I
do.
figure that's a question you don't have an answer to, but it's a great question.
It is a great question. Thank you for asking. I would have to defer that question to the Secretary to answer that.
All right, we'll ask our research if they potentially could get us some information, if you would, please, on the frequency. And you don't necessarily have to have every particular time that it's been used, but if you can get the committee an idea, please. Further questions of our revisor? Seeing none, thank you. We shall move forward with our proponents, and our first proponent this morning is Senator Mark Steffen. Senator Steffen, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Mark Steffen, State Senator, District 34. Yeah, you know, is this not the greatest bill in the world? The shortest bill. I love it. And you do have a copy of the statute that is retracting. But again, this eminent domain to the Secretary, to an appointed official is antiquated, if not wholly inappropriate from the very start. It doesn't coincide with current thought, and it really does need to go. It just needs to be removed. When you look at the bill, and it is important that each of you read the statute in particular, because it gives the appointed official the right to declare eminent domain for very whimsical reasons, such as views, appearance, light, air, health, all sorts of reasons that today, recreational purposes, all reasons today that just don't hold water. And the right thing to do is just to remove this from our statute and move on. The other interesting part is part C, where it basically indentures the Attorney General to carrying out the wishes. The Attorney General, an elected official, is indentured to carrying out the desires of an appointed official, which is very problematic from where I stand. Basically, also of note and why this is important, in my testimony, it talks about a John Adams quote from back in the day, where he says, property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. That might seem overly dramatic, but there's a lot of truth in that, and that's why we're seeing such a push among our citizens to to rebuke this ownership of land by the government. Lastly, and very importantly, eminent domain comes from a Latin term, dominion eminens, which first appeared in a 1965 treatise. Dominion eminens was granted to those with supreme lordship. I don't think we want the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks to have supreme lordship. Thank you.
Senator Stephan, we do have at least a question. Senator Reichman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, you said 1965. You was talking about eminent domain. I think that's the wrong date. All right.
1625.
Oh, my hearing is kind of bad. Okay, thank you.
It's okay.
You did say that. Okay.
I can commiserate.
The chairman said that I was correct. My question is, how did you, this came out in 1927 or whatever date. How did you happen to come up with this bill? And it's a nice short one, I appreciate that, but.
Well, I came across this as I was working on the bill to have the Wildlife and Parks Commissioners looked at by the senators.
Thank you.
I would point out, as you had, Senator Stephan, particularly in 32840C, that it does say, upon the request of the Secretary, the Attorney General shall proceed. And I had not read this statute because I'd never had any need to, but committee, that is interesting that we have that in statute, that an unelected individual can basically require an elected individual to proceed. So I would urge you to read the statute that was provided in testimony from Senator Stephan. Senator Stephan, I see no additional questions. Appreciate you appearing before the committee this morning. Oh, just a moment. We might have one here. Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not in writing here, but you did utter the word when you were saying whimsical things like view, appearance, light, and health. You said health. That's not very whimsical to me. Just had to make that observation.
And I appreciate that, but I think an individual, an unelected official defining health and invoking eminent domain as such is whimsical myself.
Seeing no additional questions, Senator Stephan, we will move to our next conferee. Our next conferee committee is Representative Ken Corbett. Representative Corbett. And my understanding, committee, is that he did not get us testimony, but he will get us testimony before the end of the day, and we will certainly provide that to you.
Thank you, Chairman and committee. As of 2019, the Post Audit Division.
I'm not sure your microphone is on.
As of 2019, the Post Audit Division of Audit declared that Kansas Wildlife and Parks was the largest landowner in the state of Kansas, over 156,000 acres. That's kind of impressive in itself. And I'm not going to go into it as far as the last speaker. He did a great job. But I think it's time that the people in Shawnee, not Shawnee County, but this state, kind of take the stance of we the people. I think it's enough. We had a hearing in tax yesterday. It's getting so bad on eminent domain that now we have to try to pass tax breaks for people who have their property taken from them, puts them in a higher tax bracket. Then the state takes then they get taxed again, then they not only lose their land, they hardly get anything out of the land they sold. So this is a great bill, and I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to see that post-audit report. If you could produce that, that would be great, or if someone else could.
I'll get that for you.
We will ask our staff representatives so you don't have to do that. And most post-audit studies committee, you can go to the post-audit website and find all of their post-audit reports. and the information, but we will still ask our staff to provide us that link so we can provide that to all committee members. Thank you. Further questions of Senator, or I'm sorry, Representative? I didn't mean to promote you, Senator, Representative.
I've been called worse. Thank you. I'm going to leave with this.
All right. Did you have a question? Senator Francisco may have a question for you, Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do understand the situation that someone who has been compensated for eminent domain would have to pay taxes, but I would not believe that that would be most of the value of that land. And if you could get us any specific information about that, it would be appreciated.
I can get you the bill that we heard yesterday, and we're just hearing it right now. So, but the two things that are bad about eminent domain, first, normally the person who it's being inflicted upon, you may have a sixth-generation piece of farm property, and you'd like to pass it down. The last thing you would want is something like this to happen. So not only you lose your property, but you kind of lose a piece of yourself. And I think there's plenty of ways to get things done in this state without going through this procedure.
Do you have any examples of people who have lost their farm or ranch over this?
I have a constituent in Coffee County, and they raise livestock and deer and whatever, and they're going to put a transmission line right through the middle of their 200 or 300 acre farm, takes out all their timber, all their habitat, and like it's basically said, there's nothing they can do about it. Cash the check.
But that would not be involved at all with the,
Same purpose. It was taken without they didn't want to lose their property. It doesn't make any difference whether it's wildlife and parks or whatever, but in wildlife and parks case, I can't even think of an instance where eminent domain would even have to come up, why they'd have to take anything.
thank you. I'm looking forward to comments by the Secretary.
Senator McGinn.
I guess I should do a little more thorough homework. I'm not confused. You said transmission lines, and
Well, just
this bill's about wildlife and park.
I know. The same situation. It was property taken.
I get it. So that's about eminent domain in general. So maybe we should just tackle eminent domain in general.
That's okay. I'd like to stay on the subject if we could.
That's what I was hoping we could too. Thank you.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Corbett, you said it was going to take away all the timber and all the land with this transmission line. Is that a bit of a hyperbole?
Would that be view? Great question, Senator Dahl.
Seeing no further questions, Representative Corbett, thank you for appearing before the committee today. Committee, I will direct your attention to written-only testimony from Jill O'Connor, a private citizen, from, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name, a Deputy Attorney General, so from the Attorney General's office, the Deputy Attorney General, and also from Mr. Matthew Steele, who is the Executive Director of the Kansas Cattlemen's Association, all provided written testimony in support of Senate Bill 417. We have no opponent testimony. We do have neutral written testimony by Secretary Lovelace, and I do see that Secretary Lovelace is in the audience, so I'm not going to ask him to testify, but if he is willing for the committee to ask him questions, we might ask the Secretary to step up if there are questions. If there are no questions, we will strictly go with the written testimony. It looks like Senator Reichman has a question. Mr. Secretary, do you mind standing for a question or two, please?
I'd be glad to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for stepping in. I have not read, I just looked at your testimony, and on your second page, it gives some hypotheticals that you could use eminent domain. And for the people that are listening or in this audience here, or help reinforce people here, the senators that are listening, could you go give us some examples where you may want to use this power? Thank you.
Yeah, so those are hypotheticals, but some of those have been used. But I'll tell you that this, to the earlier question about how often, we're glad to work very few examples over time. We use it very sparingly because there are other tools we can use that are preferable first, right? We offer money and try to work out things as a good neighbor, and that almost always works out. We've got example after example. Ones right now I can talk to you about where on the Flint Hills Trail, where we're going through a small town, we need a little corner to provide a restroom facility or a bench or something like that, so we'll purchase that, and we've done that multiple times, and that works well. Even when the landowner might want quite a bit more money than we think that land is worth, we work with them, and because that's what you do with your neighbors. A couple examples that our folks told me about. One was 15 years ago, going down K-18 south of Fort Riley. We had an access point to the Kansas River, and this is almost always used for access where there's existing access, a change occurs, and that access is no longer there. So we need to figure out a way to squeeze in, an access road. So in this case, the KDOT was widening their right-of-way, and it squeezed out this access point. And so what we did was we worked with them and the adjacent landowner, in this case used eminent domain for us enough of a roadway right alongside of the KDOT easement so we didn't lose that access point for public access. And so that's basically what we were trying to preserve in that case. And that's very typical. Another I'll mention, oftentimes, no surprise to you all, the fact that you have eminent domain is helpful in a negotiation, not to hold over somebody's head, but to know, look, we're trying to bargain in good faith and with you so we can accomplish this. One example, we had a neighbor that built a cabin on our property down in southeast Kansas. And the fact that we had this, ultimately, when that neighbor wouldn't move that house, we had to have it moved, and we exercised it in that case because they wouldn't do it. So very rare, almost always for access purposes, to allow access. Now, having said that, I will mention we almost never do. We have some landlocked properties that we've been gifted around the state, and rather than, it would have been an obvious chance to say, we need an access easement to that land so the public can get in there and use that. But we've chosen not to do that because we'd rather not use it. We only use it in extreme cases. And so in those circumstances, we're going to give that land back to the people who donated us or sell it to the neighbors rather than use eminent domain in those cases. So I believe we have shown a history of a lot of restraint when it comes to using this. The last thing I might mention is in reference to Representative Corbett's statement that we're the largest landowner in the state. He mentioned that to me yesterday in his committee, and so I asked our folks to look it up. He mentioned we have had 150-some thousand acres in 2015, I think he said, but as of now, we have about 128,000 acres. We're the 48th biggest landowner among states based on the percentage of land that is available for use by the public. So have very little public land compared to the other 50 states or 49 states. And our 128,000 acres of land and water that we own comes after the federal government, which has just over 254,000 acres. A single family, the Anschutz family, that owns over 250,000 acres and is continuing to acquire. And then the third place is KDOT, which has about 145,000 acres. So we're fourth in the state on that list. So, sorry, I was so long-winded.
Committee, further questions of Secretary Lovelace? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you've had a chance to see the testimony from the Office of the Attorney General.
I have
It was
not.
just in our packets today, and so it's the first time I've seen it. And they are particularly calling out a concern with subsection B, which relates to authorizing you as the secretary to take land from one property owner and turn it over to another with restrictions. So what I've heard from you in terms of need for access would be very different from this. So perhaps you can, I mean, I'm happy to give you a copy of this, and perhaps you could look at that particular section and give us any comments particularly about that.
Yeah, we'd be glad to do that. Earlier, there was a comment about us basically demanding that the Attorney General do something. Our relationship with the Attorney General has always been cooperative, and we consider them an important ally and partner when it comes to these kind of things. And so I can't even imagine a circumstance where we would be forcing them to do something they didn't think was wise. And we'd be glad to look at that section. If there's language that can be cleaned up to narrow this even further, I think you'll find that it's been used very seldom and very narrowly when it has been used. But it's a nice tool to have on rare occasions where we feel like we need it to serve the best interest of Kansas.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you've been a Secretary of all Parks and Life for 6 years, correct? How many times have you had a conflict and you had to use eminent domain and had to hold it or take it to litigation in your 6 years?
Less than one.
Less than one.
So to give you an idea, I didn't even know we had this. We don't even discuss this, right? It's something our lawyers know about, but this is a surprise to me that this was our right because we use it so rarely. We don't consider it. It's not even close to the top of our list of things to consider when we're challenged by a land situation.
Committee, I would remind you, when we're talking about legislation such as this, we're not throwing stones at any current secretary because we have had past secretaries, we will have future secretaries. And so if this legislation does move forward, it's not because of anything to do with Secretary Lovelace. Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Lovelace, for being here today. Just a statement first before my question. I think that maybe there is an issue with the link under the Senate committees because the agenda for the Ag Committee is not visible. And Senator McGinn brought it up that we're surprised that there aren't private citizens testifying today on this. And I think it may not be visible to the general public, so we may want to take a look at that. But for Secretary Lovelace, maybe you could answer my previous question, which was, do you have any idea of what was going on in 1925 or 27 of why this was originally put into play? Because eminent domain, I think when most of us think of eminent domain, it's not to, it's for public benefit, but it's more for necessity. Right. And I think most of the issues that you had brought up as far as like putting in a bench or a check-in location or something may not be a necessity. It may be convenient, but may not be the absolute be-all, end-all of a park if you can't put something exactly where you want it. So,
absolutely agree. Yeah, that's a great point. We just don't consider using this until it's the circumstances where you've exhausted everything else, but it's plain to everyone except maybe one person that it's in the majority's best interest to be able to inconvenience them to a small degree. Certainly not for a bench, certainly not for a restroom, those kind of things. You're absolutely right. The only reference historically that I have when I talked to our attorney, Terry Bruce, was that he said that there was a review. It sounds like in the early days, this power was given to a lot of entities in the state, but there was a review by the legislature, you'll see in my notes, during the 2006 legislative session. And their intent in that was to kind of clean up the eminent domain's appearance in a lot of statutes. And so they did that, and they chose at that point to leave this limited use ability with wildlife and parks. So we were one of the few that were left, so I know they were answering the question that we're talking about today. Is it necessary for us to retain this? Their answer at that time was yes, it was.
Our reviser has some information that may help clarify some of the questions or answer some questions. Reviser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so I was able to look up the original bill that enacted this statute. It was 1927 Senate Bill 199, and this section was part of a much larger bill relating to Fish and Game, which was the predecessor to Wildlife and Parks. And it appears to me, I haven't had time to read the entire bill, but it appears that this bill is establishing the recreational grounds, the Fish and Game Commission. It was essentially leading up to the creation of Wildlife and Parks. So this was a very large Fish and Game bill in 1927.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that information. Seeing no further questions, Secretary Lovelace, again, appreciate your willingness to stand before the committee and provide question or answers to questions. We have no additional neutral, so we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 417. Committee, I would, before we adjourn, direct your attention to something that is handed out in front of you from Deputy Secretary Kelsey Olson of the Department of Agriculture regarding the feral swine. I thought it was beneficial for us to have a little bit of more information because we had put an additional $25,000 into their budget, and the graph on the front looks like they're doing a fairly good job. There are some notes and information on the back that I found it interesting that it says that feral hogs have been sighted in 29 Kansas counties. I didn't realize that we had that much of a problem. So go ahead and read the information. But again, that's just provided for your information. We won't do anything with it at that time because the Ways and Means will be working the Department of Agriculture budget this morning. Having nothing for the